Believe it or not, it is a frigid 55 degrees here in Southern California, and that might not sound cold to the rest of the world, but it might as well be the frozen tundra if we're talking about the Golden State. So we are holed up in the shop, attempting to make at least some form of progress on the Model A, and today we're going to start with rebuilding our fuel system. Our goal for this episode is to fire the Model A up for the first time in over 2 years, and the first item on our checklist is to replace the foam inside of our fuel cell. If you watched the last episode, you may remember the fact that we realized after going through it, this foam is technically supposed to be replaced once every year. Given that I'm going to be selling the hot rod and I want it to be safe for the next person, I figure we should follow those steps. So we're going to rinse and repeat. We're pulling the fuel cell out of the hot rod one more time and tearing it down. Now, although it appears that this fuel cell has a lid that's removable, that just gives us access to the plastic bladder inside. To actually replace the foam, it's all got to be pulled out and then replaced through the top port. Removal, on one hand, is simple. I'm not really worried if this stuff survives. We're just going to yank it out. To be honest, this stuff all looks like it's in perfect shape, and I'm not quite sure this is a necessary step, but some of you may remember some of the issues we encountered all the way back in some of our first Model A episodes where the E85 in our fuel system caused a lot of damage. And I don't know if perhaps there's some sort of micro-level wear on this foam that will introduce particles into our fuel filter and, worse, our injectors or engine. With all of the fuel out of the cell, it's time to put the new foam in. And this time I'm being more careful to make sure nothing gets damaged. Reinstallation was admittedly somewhat tricky. Once the two outer foam blocks were in place, the pickup feet have to go underneath them, and then the main block of foam has to be squeezed in between the two pickup lines. It's not hard to do, but it definitely feels clunky, and I think putting in the pickups afterwards would be even more of a challenge. I think we are in, sitting nice and flat. Our slots are in the right spot. Don't know that I think it was totally necessary, but hey, the little sticker says so. And whoever has this truck next can sleep easily knowing that their fuel cell foam is in good shape. That's item number 1 crossed off our list, and one step closer to making the Model A run. Up next, we have to reinstall the fuel cell, which comes with a few small hurdles we need to clear before we can cross that off the list too. Primarily, the focus is on cleanup, because a lot of dust and dirt has accumulated on this thing, given that it has been parked for the better part of 4 years, minus a couple of test drives last time it was up and running. I'd love to pretend like glass cleaner is my secret catch-all cleaning substance. And in a way it is. It gets oil off of anything. If you've got like oil residue all over something, it's great. But in this case, it was just the nearest can. I won't lie though, the glass cleaner did the trick, and it got our raw aluminum panels looking pretty good, all things considered. The chassis and the fuel cell also get a wipe down, and then it's time for reinstallation. The Model A has a steel cradle or cage that actually holds the fuel cell, and it's fully surrounded by heavy-duty chassis members in the event somebody actually rear-ends this thing. Lastly, aluminum locking plates bolt the whole thing into place and finish the overall aesthetic of this thing, including way too many rivets I hope to never revisit. With the fuel cell locked firmly into place and our fuel lines reconnected to it, that's another project complete, and we're off to a good start. Technically speaking, we should be more or less ready to fire this thing up. After all, theoretically, this thing ran when parked. But before we fire it up for the first time, we've got to go get fuel. All we have here is the E85 that came out of this thing, And E85 pulls moisture out of the air and it kind of absorbs it, and the octane rating plummets very quickly. And since this is a boosted high compression motor, we can't have that. So we gotta go get some new 85, we'll throw that stuff out. And then while we're out, we might as well go pick up steel that we can build the kind of the front grille assembly cage out of, if you will. Not cage, but structure to support the whole thing and the intercooler. But I think once we come back, we'll put some fuel in this thing, and if everything powers up and it's happy, we can fire it up for the first time in God knows how long. Now, to most, this will be obvious, but for those of you that aren't in the know, E85 is a particular type of fuel. It's corn-based instead of petroleum-based like normal gasoline. E85 has some major upsides and downsides, but on the list of pros, on one hand, it is incredibly cheap. It comes in at about half of the cost of a gallon of gasoline, but on the other hand, it's not as efficient. You have to burn more of it to make the same amount of power. However, it does have really high octane, about 100 on the American scale, which means it's about the same as race gas. And it also has fantastic cooling properties, which makes it perfect for forced induction engines like this one. But it's always some give and some take because, as you guys have seen and will continue to see, E85 is corrosive. You're not supposed to let it sit in your fuel system, and I have learned this the hard way in the past, and I have a feeling we might learn it again. But for now, we've got 5 gallons of fresh alcohol corn-based fuel in hand and some new steel so we can rebuild the front grille shell of the Model A. I forgot there's one last thing on the list we need in order to power this thing on, and that's to replace the battery. I'm a huge fan of these anti-gravity lithium batteries, and I say that as a retail customer, not a sponsorship. This small, tiny pint-sized battery has more than enough power to turn over a 5-liter supercharged engine with room to spare. And because it's lithium-based, this battery only weighs about 2 pounds. It's a featherweight. Unfortunately, I killed the last one by completely depleting it, so here's a new one, but this time I have swapped the poles on the battery so that it's a little bit more clear of the chassis and less likely to arc out. Instead, we've got the ground up against the chassis itself, which is fine because the chassis is the ground. Okay, so we've got the battery installed, we've got the fuel cell rebuilt and reinstalled as well, and it's time to put fresh fuel in this thing. So what is your guess? Is this thing going to fire up after sitting for the last 26 months? Honestly, I think we're ready to fire it up. I've been chewing on it while we were getting fuel, trying to think about what else do I need to do before I at least turn the thing on, and I can't come up with anything else other than check our fluids, and we'll see if it lives. I don't know why it wouldn't fire up, but hopefully it does. So, I guess here goes nothing. Now, we're off to a good start because the fuel pumps do kick on, which means all of the electronics work. But as the fuel system started to pick fuel up and out of the cell and started to pressurize the rest of the system, it was pretty clear we've got a big problem. Just coming out of it? Yep, we've got fuel leaks. And if it looks like it's just coming from a bad fitting, you'd be mistaken. It's coming from the line itself. The problem is that despite having E85's safe fuel line, I let E85 sit in it for literally years, and that's the one thing you're not supposed to do. It's fine as fuel flows through it, but as it sits, the E85's corrosivity will dissolve the rubber, and eventually, micro cracks will allow the fuel to come out of the fuel line, even in the middle of it. We could replace the one line that's leaking, but chances are it's only a matter of time before the next line begins to do the same. And make no mistake, this truck is already dangerous enough as it is. It's got nearly 900 horsepower at the crank, it weighs 2,200 pounds, and it's got a wheelbase shorter than a Miata. So I don't need to add potential explosivity to the mix when we're talking about potential problems. So as a result, we're going to replace all of the fuel lines on the car, front to back, and there's a lot of them. It's not a small job. But we're going to replace it all with fresh, vibrant stuff that is PTFE. PTFE line hose and PTFE fittings. so that it's all E85 safe. It won't get dissolved over time, whether I own this thing long enough to let it happen again, or whenever somebody else buys this thing, they can leave E85 in it as long as they want. Vibrant told us this would happen. I didn't listen. Lesson learned. Let's make some new fuel lines. And so step number 1 becomes removing all of the fuel lines from the car. In and of itself, no small task, and just one of many in order to get this job finished. And there's a lot of hose here because there's a lot of parts to this system. This truck has 3 fuel pumps, 2 lift pumps, and then 1 high-pressure inline pump to send fuel to the front of the truck. It also has 2 different fuel filters, which makes for a somewhat complex system that has a lot of parts that we're going to need to service. I want to give everything a thorough once-over. So, for anybody wondering what kind of gross stuff that E85 does, it's this. This stuff is... I'm not even sure what it is. Somebody out there will know the science behind it, but it's like crystals forming from this thing sitting. Obviously, we can't get into it without cutting a filter open. But that's nasty, nasty, nasty stuff. The state of California wouldn't want me to touch that. At this point, it's a silver lining that we had a fuel leak because it's abundantly clear we've got to tear this entire fuel system apart and replace more or less everything. We can't have contaminants like this in the system or we're going to blow up an engine. So on top of pulling all of the fuel lines out of the car, we're going to pull those pumps and those filters out too and replace it all. Given that I want to sell this thing, I'm not thrilled about spending thousands of dollars to redo a bunch of stuff, but I want to do this the right way because that's the only way I know how. With all of the parts removed from the car, it's time to start rebuilding these fuel lines one by one, and thankfully we have the old lines to use as a template for length and overall fitment. Assembling these hoses is relatively straightforward, but if you're new to the channel, you may have missed the super in-depth AN fitting and hose assembly video that I did a couple of years ago. So if you want all of the details on this stuff, check that one out. But for these PTFE lines, assembly requires separating the outer braided stainless structure from the PTFE liner so that there is room for a crushable ferrule inside. This system works kind of like combining normal AN fittings with compression fittings. They can be kind of tricky to get going, and there's a bit of a learning curve, but once you get it figured out and know how much to splay the stainless braided hosing, assembly becomes pretty simple and you can knock out several per hour. Just watch those fingertips because you're gonna slice them up. After a full day of remaking all of the AN lines on the car again, it's time to move on to installing components. So I bought a brand new pair of Holley fuel pumps, primarily because I already have mounts for these welded to the chassis. It's the easier way to do it. At the same time, we're also going to replace both of our fuel filters so that everything in this system is brand new. This smaller filter is a standard 10 micron fuel injection filter, which goes after our fuel pumps to make sure nothing gets to the injectors. The bigger one, on the other hand, is a 3 micron filter used to actually separate water from the fuel itself. As mentioned, these alcohol-based fuels tend to pull moisture from the air, and this filter helps make sure that that moisture doesn't make it into the engine should that happen. If we keep fresh fuel in it, it's usually not an issue. Along with the pump supply and feed lines, we also need to replace the lines that run from the back of the truck all the way up to the fuel rail, between the fuel rails, and then back for the return. I want to make sure that every part of this fuel system has been replaced, even going so far as to have the injectors sonic cleaned before we put this thing back on the dyno. Although nothing is visible from the top side of the car, I also want to take the time to make sure all of our hoses are routed nicely, and then of course are cable tied into place so that they look good and won't move around, creating a potential hazard. At this point, we've replaced the entire fuel system, and now it's time to find out if it worked. All right, let's see. Okay, we got power. Fuel 1. The fuel system pressurized without a hitch, and with that done, it sounds like it's time for the final once-over before we attempt to fire this thing up. I spent considerable time making sure there wasn't anything I was forgetting, including making sure that there was oil in the engine. That would be a bummer to leave out of the equation. The motor won't have any coolant in it, nor the intercooler, but we don't need that to let it run at least for a few seconds. That will come later in the episode. For now, all of our ducks are in a row, and I think it's finally time to find out whether or not this Coyote motor is going to run once again. It runs. That's pretty cool. But we're not done yet. We still have an entire nose cone to rebuild. Some of you may remember that the accident caused a little bit of damage to the original 1931 grille shell, and with it, the internal slat structure that I built as the front grille. Honestly, given that I T-boned a car hard enough to total it, the damage here is pretty minor and could probably be fixed, but I don't know that it's worth the squeeze. The grille shell itself isn't all that damaged either, and somebody more talented than me could probably straighten it out, but I hopped on eBay and just bought another original 31 grille. In contrast to the old one, yeah, it's in a lot better shape, but it's far from perfect, but it'll fit the rest of the truck. So let's toss this old one and rebuild everything. Starting with the grille, I bought a new mechanism, and yes, for the curious, this is just a louvered window mechanism, for a house. Now, if you're wondering why I have a louvered front grille, it's because I think it looks pretty sweet and offers multiple different design styles in one package. We're going to reuse the slots from the old grille because they are undamaged. And while it might look like they're wood slats, this is actually black phenolic material. It's synthetic, and with that, it's largely heat-proof, which is great considering it's sitting right in front of a bunch of hot stuff. Now, given that the slats already have all of the holes drilled in them from the previous assembly, and they're already cut to shape, we can use them to template the entire new assembly and get all of our holes drilled in position without having to make any complex measurements. We're really just transferring everything over. With everything assembled, there are just a few small adjustments we have to make for this thing to fit into the old grille shell. Namely, some of the corners have to be cut off to fit the top radius. Width-wise, it's a perfect fit, and the slats will open up through the front of the grille shell itself. On the previous assembly, I used small hardware to bolt the louver structure to the grille shell, but I found that it tried to vibrate its way loose on more than one occasion, so this time I'm just going to rivet it into place because there's also no real reason to take these things apart. One rivet at each corner will do the trick, and if we do need to disassemble it for any reason, that means we only have to drill 4 out. Honestly, I love this front grille design. It hides the intercooler and the headlights from view, and it's a really unique look that I haven't seen anywhere else, and it still matches the rest of the aesthetic of the hot rod. To mount it, we've got to talk about the grille frame, the third piece of the puzzle. And as you can tell, this isn't in bad shape, but it's definitely bent from the accident. Initially, I figured we'd just rebuild this. That's why we bought material earlier in the episode, but after looking more closely at it, I kind of want to try fixing it. Shaping metal isn't necessarily a skill set that I have developed very much, and this isn't a consequential piece that has to be truly perfect, so I spent a bit of time with the arbor press, bumping, skewing, and stretching it in each direction until it was finally squared up. Given that I built this 6 years ago when I was a much less talented fabricator, I think it's probably pretty safe to say it's as straight and square now as it ever was. It checks out, it looks the part, and I'm happy that we didn't spend an entire day redesigning it. We know that it fits and everything works together, and I think this was a job well done that also allowed me to work on some skills I want to develop. But just to be clear, it has to be perfect, so we mocked it up on the workbench and then got out the laser level to make sure this thing is square and straight. And to be honest, it's not quite perfect, but any variances come down to the fact that this grill shell is nearly a century old and just isn't straight to begin with. Ignoring that, this thing looks really good, just as good as it did before, and I think it's time to finally mount it up on the truck. I spent a while trying to decide exactly how to mount the grill shell structure until realizing I should just keep it simple and bolt it directly to the chassis. Why overcomplicate this when this is the best possible solution? Especially given that the grill structure will weigh quite a bit once the water-to-air intercooler is in place and full of water. In the event I or somebody else drives this thing into a curb or something of the sort, I don't want to have some sort of catastrophic failure, and this seems like the best possible way to do it. I'll come back for the headlight install later, but for now, I just want to get the intercooler in place so that we can actually bolt up the grill shell in its final assembly and call this done. Now there's a lot of pieces in play here, so how I want to attach the grill shell and louver assembly to the frame we just attached to the chassis is with riv nuts. This means I won't have to access hardware on the backside and can do it all from one direction with just 4 bolts. I'm trying to make this serviceable in the event I or anybody else needs to take it apart. The only change I found that I had to make was the fact that the grill shells are a slightly different shape from each other, I believe because the old one was a reproduction. This one has a slightly different crown to the top of it, and that means the top slat doesn't quite articulate in the right way to clear the structure inside of it. I know that's complicated, but to put it simply, I had to take roughly an 1/8 inch off the top for everything to open and close correctly. With that small detail out of the way, all that's left is to actually cut the bottom of the grill shell off. Now while honestly I think it would look pretty sweet to leave it long and simply let it fold underneath the truck as it drives, it's connected to vital equipment and I don't think that's the best idea. So we'll create a false trim strip to go on the bottom that still matches the riveted aluminum aesthetic, and we'll cut it off. We also still need to attach the hood, or at least what's left of it. I cut the original hood down to 8 or 10 inches in overall length so that it could cover up some of the front-end accessory drive, some of the wiring, and the headlights and intercooler, and to give it a more finished look. Some riv nuts are all that are needed to hold this in place as well, 2 on each side using an M5 bolt, and the original centered hinge still works so that we can get access to the inside if needed. Unfortunately, I'll have to replace our H&R sticker on the front grille because it got damaged during assembly, but you know we'll have to put a new one on because they are a vital part of this truck even being a reality. With the grille cut and reshaped so that it looks good from afar and follows our trim piece we stole off the other grille, I think this thing is done. So we're going to move on to installing brake lines. And if you're wondering, why are you doing that? That's a fair question. The truth is, I actually stole the main rear brake line from this thing so that we could get the Ferrari done for Australia. Now, some of you might be averse to soft line brakes for the entirety of a vehicle, and that's fair. I would never say that it's the right decision, but I've done it on a handful of projects and it's worked out great. and I've also seen it done by some of the best race shops in the world, such as ProDrive. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. I've never had the brake lines snake under pressure, but you make the choice that's best for you if you want hard lines instead. So it's time for some hose management once again. With the hose snaked under the truck, I want to make sure that nothing can happen to it because of all the hoses, this is probably the most vital one. We'll get it attached all over the place so it can't come loose or rub against anything. And we need to add some provisions to mount the front brake lines to the chassis itself because this stuff is all new. Once again, I'm going to rely on some riv nuts because it's the perfect way to add some threads to the chassis without having to tap the thin material itself. Yeah, the brakes need bleeding, but they're done, so let's keep crossing other stuff off the list. Up next are the bolts for the headers. In the last episode, we got these bolted on with just 2 bolts each, so I've got to get in there and fiddle with it until all 8 bolts are on each side. We've got to fill up the water-to-air intercooler system, and then we've got to fill up the radiator itself with both coolant and water. Now, getting this crazy rear radiator system to bleed properly given that the radiator is way above everything else is tricky, but I added a bleed port to the back of the engine to make it simple, and when water comes out, I know the job is done. In fact, it was this system that supplied the ant server how to solve a similar issue on the Ferrari in terms of getting it properly bled. In the past, this system worked great on the Model A, and I haven't had any cooling issues so far, so let's hope that it stays that way. With the cooling system finished up, we're going to put the Model A back down on the ground because we are finally there. I think it's time to roll this thing outside and finally find out if it will run for real. Now, to reiterate, there's still so much left to do on this thing to really make it finished, but it's on its own weight, it's holding itself up, the engine runs, the nose cone is back on, we've got coolant in it, you saw it all, I don't need to explain it again. I think we're finally ready to roll this thing outside and actually fire it up and let it run for a second for the first time in God knows how long, 2 years at least, over 2 years now. It feels pretty good. We are on the home stretch, I know I've been saying it, but this feels like a real turning point. It's just small details left, so let's celebrate the occasion. Let's see. I wish I was driving somewhere. All right, ignition on. Here goes fuel 1, fuel 2. Yep. Yeah, that's still sick. All right, now it definitely runs. Let's just get those details done and take this thing for a first drive, along with making sure we check the steering shaft so it doesn't come apart. I'm stoked.